In Brownsville, Texas, First Brands Group is shutting down 3 facilities, and 572 jobs are scheduled to disappear by April 30th. WARN notices break that total into 346 manufacturing roles, 183 distribution jobs, and 43 positions at the ASC facility. For Brownsville, this is not an abstract balance sheet event. It is a hard deadline for workers, families, and suppliers tied to a plant network that once looked stable. The shock is larger because it follows a corporate collapse that had already moved into bankruptcy court. First Brands filed for Chapter 11 in September 2025, and prosecutors later accused senior executives of running a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme tied to lending and collateral. Former CFO Stephen Graham has pleaded guilty. Founder Patrick James and his brother Edward have pleaded not guilty. By the time the Texas shutdowns were announced, this was no longer a simple turnaround story. That is what makes First Brands worth studying. The company still owned recognizable aftermarket brands and still touched a basic, recurring need: replacement parts for cars already on the road. Yet the operating system behind that business had broken down. The real question is not why one factory closed. The real question is how a supplier with national reach reached the point where lenders, buyers, and employees all stopped trusting the same machine. Before the bankruptcy headlines, First Brands sat in a part of the auto business that usually looks durable. It sold aftermarket parts, the components drivers and repair shops need after a car leaves the assembly line. That market does not depend on one new model launch or one holiday sales cycle. It depends on a much simpler reality. Cars age, parts fail, and replacements have to keep moving. That is why the company's brand portfolio mattered. Names like Fram, Autolite, and Trico had shelf recognition with retailers and credibility with mechanics. In the aftermarket, trust is operational. A familiar brand reduces friction for the distributor, the shop, and the driver who needs a fast repair. For a supplier, that makes scale easier to defend than in a pure commodity market. The business model also spread exposure across multiple product categories. Filters, ignition components, wipers, braking products, and towing-related parts all pointed to the same thesis. Everyday maintenance is recurring demand. If management kept leverage under control and execution disciplined, the platform could look dependable for a long time. That dependable appearance is the key to the whole story. First Brands did not begin as an obviously fragile business. It began as the kind of company lenders, operators, and workers could believe in. The weakness came later, when financial engineering and control failures began to matter more than the underlying products. What made First Brands feel powerful was not consumer celebrity. It was operational reach. The company ran plants and distribution nodes across multiple states, and its products moved through the repair economy at scale. By the time it entered bankruptcy, Court Materials described a business with roughly $5 billion in annual sales. That number mattered because it reinforced the idea that this was a large platform, not a marginal supplier hanging on by a thread. Scale created a second effect: confidence. A business with national brands, broad product coverage, and billions in sales can look more resilient than it really is. Workers see a large employer. Customers see a stocked shelf. Lenders see a company that appears to throw off predictable cash from recurring maintenance demand. Success becomes something that people stop questioning. But scale can also hide structural weakness. The more complex the footprint, the more the system depends on clean reporting, disciplined financing, and credible collateral. If those controls are sound, size compounds strength. If they are not, size compounds the damage. A sprawling platform becomes harder to stabilize because every plant, every lender relationship, and every supplier contract depends on the same core assumption: the numbers are real. That is the turning point in this documentary. First Brands did not collapse because the aftermarket suddenly disappeared. It collapsed because a business that looked operationally strong became financially untrustworthy. The hard break came in bankruptcy court. First Brands filed for Chapter 11 on September 28, 2025. Court Materials described a company with roughly $12 million in cash and more than $9 billion in liabilities. For a business still reporting billions in annual sales, that gap was a warning sign that the operating footprint and the capital structure were no longer telling the same story. The criminal case made that mismatch even harder to dismiss. Prosecutors accused founder Patrick James, his brother Edward, and other executives of using falsified financial information and bad collateral to raise huge amounts of financing over several years. Former CFO Stephen Graham later pleaded guilty and began cooperating with prosecutors. Whether every charge is ultimately sustained in the same form, the damage to lender trust was already done. That trust collapse turned an already difficult restructuring into something harsher. First Brands, a company involved in bankruptcy proceedings, secured debtor-in-possession financing during Chapter 11, but reports indicate it burned through about $1.1 billion of that support, while buyer talks failed to produce a durable rescue. Once potential bidders stepped back, the bankruptcy shifted from stabilizing operations to shutting them down. This is the real crisis chapter. Not a dramatic headline, but a financing system that stopped believing its own paperwork. When that happens, factories, brands, and sales volume stop being protection. They become fixed costs attached to a credibility problem. The fallout is easiest to measure in layoffs. In Brownsville alone, 572 positions are being eliminated across manufacturing, distribution, and the ASC facility. That is the number attached to the Texas story, but it is not the full number attached to the company. In Ohio, reporting around the same bankruptcy process pointed to more than 1,200 additional job cuts across facilities in places like Cleveland, Tiffin, Greenville, and Gypsy Lane. Those cuts show how quickly a credibility crisis becomes an operating crisis. A supplier that once kept shelves stocked and parts moving can no longer reassure customers, maintain plant utilization, or convince buyers to step in. The problem is not confined to one court docket. It spreads through workforce planning, union negotiations, supplier relationships, and local tax bases. For workers, this is where corporate abstraction ends. Some of the Ohio plants involved United Auto Workers representation. In Texas, the shutdown lands in a community that depended on the facilities as a steady industrial employer. Families do not experience this as a lesson about capital structure. They experience it as a deadline, a lost paycheck, and a forced search for whatever comes next. That is why the First Brands collapse matters beyond one company. It shows how quickly leadership failure at the top can convert into cascading damage far downstream, long after the original financial decisions were made. The cleanest lesson from First Brands is that product demand cannot rescue a company once trust in the numbers disappears. This was not a business with no revenue. Bankruptcy filings described roughly $5 billion in annual sales. It was not a business with no assets or no brands. It sold familiar aftermarket names and operated a national footprint. Even so, it arrived in court with limited cash, significant liabilities, and a fraud case circling the executive suite. That combination matters because it separates market risk from governance risk. Markets can soften. Competition can intensify. Supply chains can tighten. But when internal reporting, collateral quality, and executive oversight break down at the same time, lenders stop extending patience and buyers stop trusting diligence. At that point, the business is not only under pressure, it is unreadable. So the framework here is not complicated. First, control leverage before leverage controls the company. Second, treat internal reporting as a survival system, not a compliance chore. Third, design governance so no founder circle can dominate the facts unchecked. And fourth, remember that the real cost of delayed accountability is usually paid by workers, not by the people who designed the scheme. First Brands is therefore less a story about one bad quarter than a story about system failure. If a company with scale, brands, and recurring demand can still unravel this fast, what exactly are investors and boards checking before they call a business durable?